Unitarian Universalism is a distinct religious tradition. We do not have specific theological beliefs. Congregations can be very different from each other, with some being theologically centered in one tradition or another. It's possible that congregations can follow many different paths. Most Unitarian Universalist congregations, however, are like this one, theologically diverse. We are an association of autonomous congregations that share some ethical guidelines. We call them principles. They set the basis for our collective identity. Our fifth principle states that our congregations will affirm and promote the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and our society at large. The right of conscience, the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. Democracy is so important to us that we have covenanted with each other to promote it everywhere. This is one of the foundations of our religious movement, as we understand today. This religious principle is important to us more than any other time in the 33 years that I have been a Unitarian Universalist. Democracy is under threat when people obeying the law and engaged in peaceful protest, protected by the Constitution, are being killed. Democracy is imperiled when unarmed citizens are murdered without just cause. Democracy is under threat when a mass militia is empowered to enter people's homes and arrest, tie up, and otherwise harass U.S. citizens without search warrants or other just cause. Democracy is under threat when, as the Declaration of Independence condemns, for protecting them from punishment for any murders which they commit on the inhabitants of these states. Democracy is under threat when taxes are imposed by the executive branch of government in the form of taxes on foreign goods. Tariffs are taxes. When our constitutional practice is that taxes can only originate from the legislative body of government. Democracy is under threat when the leader of the executive branch of government, as the Declaration of Independence states, has incited domestic insurrections amongst us. These are only the obvious parallels between our current executive branch and the British sovereign in the latter part of the 18th century. These are constitutional issues there are more that could be added, but the listing of them would take the remainder of the day. Our government is no longer working for the general welfare of the people of this nation. It is, however, a wonder that this did not happen sooner. The founders of the United States, the men who fought against the illegal actions of the British sovereign, and who gathered to write the U.S. Constitution, are partly to blame for this situation. They had no reliable models for the authorship of a constitutional, democratic, republican form of government. Yes, there had been republics in the past, and most of them were oligarchies, ruled by a privileged class. Rome was like that. Switzerland was a republic, but it was a confederation, not a unified state. There were other examples like the governorates of American indigenous peoples, but I strongly doubt that many European Americans were generally referencing those forms, despite what some current historians claim. Many of the founders of this nation were in favor of an oligarchy, especially in the South. It just was not believed that ordinary people had the knowledge to take part in governance. They might not be able to think things through. So few people then could read. Despite our current praise for our government, it was not as democratic as we would like to think. More than half the population could not vote. Slavery was practiced almost everywhere, in the 1700s, even in the North, at the time of the American Revolution, and even later. The founders of this country had no models for the nation that they were attempting to create through a constitution that would set forth the mechanisms of government. They turned to what they knew, which was the British government. Yes, the British government. Britain at the time had two legislative branches, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The House of Commons was elected. The House of Lords was a mostly hereditary chamber at the time, with senior clergymen like Anglican archbishops and bishops also being seated there. In Parliament, bills originated in the House of Commons and, if passed, went to the House of Lords for approval. If the Lords voted a bill down, it either died or went into negotiation with the House of Commons. The King or Queen signed the legislation, or it went into negotiation between the sovereign and the Parliament. Only Parliament could introduce or raise taxes. The King or Queen at the time of the American Revolution could not act independently of Parliament. Royal power was only to be used to execute the laws that Parliament passed. When King George III of Great Britain harassed the American colonies, he did so partly with the assent of the British Parliament, which had not defined the role of the monarch to the territories across the Atlantic. When creating the American Constitution, guess what? The founders created a lower legislative house from which all tax bills were to arise, and a smaller second legislative house that would also debate and pass or negotiate taxes with a lower house, like Parliament. They also created an executive branch that would carry out the legislative branch's laws, led by a leader who wielded power. There were obvious differences, though. The British monarch was hereditary rather than elected and was in power for life rather than for a term. The greatest innovation of the American Revolution was the power of the judicial branch. They could interpret the Constitution and rule that the legislative and executive branches were violating the terms of government. The courts could correct the system of governance. This system was similar to the British government of the 18th century. Yes, there were more white men voting. Yes, there was no hereditary political caste. Yes, there was an elected president rather than a hereditary monarch. However, many of the powers were, and I would say are, still similar. The founders of the United States probably never imagined, with the checks and balances of the political system, that one party would take all the branches of national government. They probably never imagined that someone who shared little knowledge or respect for the democratic form of government would lead the nation they had created. Their basic assumption was in the good of the people. They presumed that the person chosen as the executive and in Parliament would be men who were intelligent and were of good repute. After all, who would want to be governed again by King George III of Great Britain? Because they believed that the leader who led this nation would be a man of the people. They believed that he would respect democracy, even in the limited form they had created. Democracy in the United States is currently threatened by the very people who are supposed to be securing it. Masked men wander through our nation with undefined power and the ability to kill people and arrest them without charging them with a crime. They do so under the authority granted to them by the executive branch, in clear violation of due process and the laws of this nation, but with the support of the legislative and judicial branches of government. Many groups of people live in fear of our government, like our predecessors did of the government of George III. Groups of people are finding the existence of people like them, their contributions, their history erased. Every day, the news presents violations of democratic governance. They are at this point too numerous to recite to you this morning. Democracy will prevail, though. Too many people are connected to let this proceed. There are those in military and in the police who believe in democracy. We are still too connected to let ourselves fall for authoritarian rule. There are still people who have faith that this nation will live its values, maybe even for the first time. There are still too many of us who believe in the promise of a society that affirms and promotes the inherent worth and dignity of every person. The ultimate reality is that the threat of our decline as a nation, industrially, culturally, scientifically, economically, is already being felt. It would be better if this challenge to our nation were only about human rights or mutual respect. It should be that way, but that by itself has rarely been the factor that motivated us in this nation to do the right thing. Ultimately, the world will respond to the government of the United States. American democracy needs better checks and balances to sustain a working system. Other democratic nations have experienced evolution in the past 250 years. Our nation has not experienced fundamental change in the same time in its mechanisms. Perhaps it is time for our system, based upon the old British government in the 18th century, to adapt to the needs of our changed nation. The British government seems so stolid outwardly since the reign of George III. Yet change has happened incrementally. The British monarch lost power in part because of the American Revolution and the rise of the industrial middle class. When King Charles III of Great Britain goes to the Palace of Westminster for the ceremonial opening of Parliament, he is taken to the robing room to don his ermine cloak and the imperial state crown. On the wall of the robing room in the Palace of Westminster, affixed is a framed parchment document on the wall, affixed with a wax seal. This is the room that Charles III will put on his crown. This document is the warrant for the execution of King Charles I of England and Scotland, signed by previous parliamentary leaders, just as a sobering reminder to the king of what might happen to monarchs who exceed their boundaries. This document also serves as a memoir of changes in the way the government functions. This nation is facing a challenge potentially every bit as great as the Civil War. Our system needs to evolve beyond the great man thinking of the Enlightenment era that has framed our thinking for so long. What might that look like? What checks would we put into place to prevent authoritarian rule? How might we give greater opportunity to groups of people in our society who have experienced oppression for centuries? One of the things that I have heard repeatedly for the past 30 years from friends and acquaintances is that the two major political parties do not reflect well what many people actually believe in our democracy. For some, this curtails their participation in the political process. Our nation has a low rate of participation in voting compared with other democratic nations. Few of our citizens vote. We need to think again of the power of the presidency. Most of our leaders have exercised restraint, understanding that they were of the people and needed to serve the needs of the greatest number. We have reason to question the power that has been given and the arduous task, and have the arduous task of correcting that power when it has been misused. In closing, democracy is the outgrowth in our movement of our first principle to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Democracy should always be on our minds as it derives from our commitment to human worth and dignity. We Unitarian Universalist congregations are here to seek meaning and to serve the larger good. When ministers speak to you, they often impart knowledge, and they also give you, if they are Unitarian Universalist ministers, often give you more questions than you came in with. I guess you can tell which kind of sermon this is today. We are a people of diverse beliefs, and we are also people who have hope that the world can be better for our care. May our efforts promote freedom, encourage kindness, and foster responsibility in our hearts, and faith, and hope, and love.